Welcome, brave souls, to a night of mystery and terror. Are you ready to step into the darkness? Hold your breath, because tonight's story will haunt you long after the lights go out. The skin of the 8-foot-tall beast that's attacking you, and you start cursing at the trees. Maybe you'll finally realize you should have brought that elephant gun to deer hunt with, this one time. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. I'm proud to present a brand new volume in the illustrious catalog of scary hunting stories. In this episode, you'll find tales of giant winged creatures, demonic mountains, missing people, and more. Enjoy. Send me your scary unexplained stories so I can narrate them on the show at darkstories.org. By the way, you should go hunting for my new book, Creepy Campfire Stories, because it's filled with the perfect terrifying outdoorsy tales to share around your campsite, all in a beautiful hardcover book. Search for Creepy Campfire Stories on Amazon, or click the link in the description. And now, the first 100 pre-orders will actually get the very first Darkness Prevails plushie. Aw, look how scary he thinks he is. Only 100 of these will ever exist, and you have to pre-order Creepy Campfire Stories on Amazon and verify your order with the link below. So hurry up, there's limited stock. Plushie ships after the book releases July 8th, 2025. Thank you. Now, let's begin. The Crawling Man of BC. From Ripness. I'm in elk hunter in northern British Columbia, and I know you probably hear it a lot, but I know the wilderness here. The way it sounds, how dangerous it is, and where. I've actually encountered some wolves and some bears before. No cougars, though. I'm explaining this because what I saw during my hunting trip last November defies all explanation, and I haven't slept good since. Now, I prefer to hunt alone. Always have. There's something pure about being self-reliant in the wild, making every decision yourself, experiencing nature without other people's voices to break the spell. My usual spot is about 40 miles north of Fort Nelson, deep in the boreal forest, where a few people go, especially once the snow begins to fall. I tracked a small herd of elk through the fresh snow when I got there, set up base camp near Frozen Creek, and settled into the rhythm of the hunt. The cold was pretty bad that year, dropping to about -30 at night, and that's Celsius, by the way. But I came prepared, with proper gear and a well-insulated tent. It was the fourth morning when things really changed. I woke up before dawn and hiked about 2 miles from camp to a ridge overlooking a small valley, where I had spotted elk tracks the previous day. When the sun fully rose, I got a good look of things, and that's when I noticed movement in a clearing below. At first, my assumption was some kind of wounded animal, maybe a deer dragging itself through the snow. I raised my binoculars for a better look, and what I saw still chills me right down to the marrow. It wasn't an animal, not your typical one. It was humanoid, unmistakably so, but wrong in every possible way. What I was looking at was a completely hairless figure, skin so pale it nearly blended with the snow around it, except for its faint grayish-blue tint. It moved around on all fours, but not the way a human would attempt to crawl. Its limbs bent in the wrong places, too late or too early, I couldn't tell from that distance, and it navigated the snow with disturbing efficiency. It looked like a pale nude man who couldn't even feel the biting cold of the snow. I watched, frozen to the spot. The thing approached what I now could see was a dead snowshoe hare. Without hesitation, the thing began to eat at it, tearing into the hare with bare hands and teeth. The temperature was well below freezing, as I said, and yet this naked creature showed no signs of discomfort. No shivering, no condensation from its breath, if it was breathing, and it didn't even seem to feel numb. For about 15 minutes, I watched this bizarre thing through my binoculars. It thankfully never looked my way, focusing entirely on its meal. When it was done, it simply crawled away, disappearing into the dense forest real quick. I gave up on the hunt that day, going back to camp. I was thinking something like, what kind of crazed, psychotic man is out here killing himself in the cold? Possibly it was someone with mental illness who had somehow survived out here. But without clothes, crawling around in freezing temperatures? Nonsense. Deep down, I knew something was wrong, and I knew that no human moved that way. I did think about packing up and going home, but my time off was rare, and I'd been planning this hunt for a few months. I was thinking surely nothing could happen to me, right? I saw that thing from a distance. All those YouTube videos of people encountering or seeing things, it's always from a distance. So nothing would happen to me. That night in my tent, every crack of a branch outside made me jump. I kept my rifle loaded beside my sleeping bag. The next day I made sure to stay closer to my camp. I wanted to salvage my hunt, but I was still unwilling to venture too far. I was happy, though, when I was able to take down a young elk in the early afternoon, about a half-mile from my tent. Field dressing it took longer than I hoped, and dusk was settling in as I finished. I returned to camp as the sun was going down. My mind was preoccupied with how I'd transport the elk meat the next morning. As I approached my campsite, I noticed the entrance flap to my tent was open, but I remembered closing it that morning. I raised my gun and called out, thinking perhaps another hunter had stumbled upon my camp. But I didn't get a response. I moved closer, scanning the area. And then I saw it. It was emerging from my tent, crawling headfirst on all fours, the same pale thing I saw yesterday. In the faint light, I could see its features more clearly, up close. Its face was almost human, but wild and more bestial. In fact, its eyes reflected the dying light, like an animal's, not like a person's. Our eyes met. It stared at me. It recognized me as another thinking thing, and I did the same to it. And in that moment I knew what I was encountering was supernatural. Its mouth opened. I saw the glints of pointed teeth. So I fired a shot. I don't even think I was thinking at the moment. It was just reflex and panic. I saw it flinch, but it didn't flee right away. Instead, it continued to stare at me for several seconds, but then finally crawled backward with that same disturbing spider-like movement and disappeared into the underbrush. I ran to my tent quickly, wondering what it had done to my stuff. But everything was as I'd left it, except for my sleeping bag. It had been unzipped, apparently, laid open, as if prepared for someone or something to crawl inside. Now, how did it know to do that? I packed up immediately, abandoning some of my gear in my rush. I hiked through the night to reach my truck, using my headlamp in the full moon's light. I didn't stop a single time. Every time I got a little bit tired, I'd see that thing's face in my head, and suddenly feel more motivated. To this day, I try my best to rationalize what I saw. It could be two things, I think. One, a person with some sort of severe condition. Or two, it was supernatural. Some sort of creature that should not be in our dimension. I've researched cryptids and legends of the region before, but from what I've read, nothing in that particular region seems to line up. Who knows what it is? We saw the monster bird. From Anonymous. Every year since my boys turned 18, The three of us have made a tradition of duck hunting together. One of them is 32 now, and the other is 29, and I can proudly say that both of them have families of their own now. But come October, we still carve out a few weekends to wade into the marshes of eastern Iowa with our waders, shotguns, and the chocolate lab of ours, Duke. Last season we hit our usual spot, at a lake that I'll keep unnamed for the sake of privacy, but I will say it's nearish to Cedar Rapids. It's a secluded place that backs up against state forest land. Not exactly a secret spot, but enough off the beaten path that we rarely run into other hunters. It was a good morning too, sky clear and perfect for duck hunting. We set up in our favorite patch of reeds around 5:30 a.m., arranging the decoys in the shallow water, and we settled in to wait. Duke was rearing to go, at my older boy's side, occasionally whining, just begging to chase something down. By 7 a.m. we'd spotted several groups of mallards circling the area. Everything seemed to be shaping up for a good hunt. A flock of about 15 mallards approached from the north, flying in that typical V formation. We got our shotguns ready, waiting for them to come within range. But instead of continuing their descent toward our decoys, the entire flock suddenly dropped. Not in the controlled way ducks usually land, but more like they'd been yanked downward by invisible strings. They splashed into the water about 60 yards out. And then, nothing. What the heck was that about? My younger boy asked me. I shrugged, telling him maybe they spotted us. But honestly, I'd never seen birds act like that before. We tried making some calls, but the ducks remained motionless on the water's surface. From what I could see, though, it almost looked like the ducks were alive, alert even, heads swiveling nervously, but they wouldn't budge. Something had spooked them suddenly and badly. My older boy sent Duke to flush them out, thinking they might take off when approached by the dog. Duke swam out excitedly, but even with him splashing about just feet away, the ducks just paddled in tight circles, refusing to fly. Good Lord, I've never seen them like this before, I told the two of them. I've been duck hunting for 30 years. I've seen birds get spooked. I've seen birds get too comfortable. Even some birds that seem to mock us for our poor decoy arrangements. But never have I ever seen ducks too terrified to fly. It just sounded like opposite day. But that's the word we were seeing here. Terror. These birds were too afraid to even leave the water. To them, they'd rather be eaten by a dog than go back in the air. My younger boy stood up, waving his arms around and shouting to flush them out, and even that didn't work. The ducks huddled closer together and quacked softly. But then we heard something, a sound that gave me goosebumps instantly. An extremely high-pitched screech cut through the air. If it was a bird, it was unlike anything I'd ever heard, and it sounded big. It started as something similar to a hawk's cry, but rose in pitch and volume, until it felt like it was vibrating inside my skull. Duke whimpered now. He was scared too. He swam in a panic back to shore and shook violently as my older boy pulled him in. "Dad, what is that?" My younger boy asked. I'd never seen him scared like that either. Not since he believed the boogeyman was in his closet. The sound came again, much louder than before, from somewhere behind us over the tree line. All three of us turned toward the sound, and that's when the shadow fell over us. Something massive was moving above the pine trees at the edge of the marsh. My brain struggled to make sense of it. Was this a low-flying plane of some sort? Maybe a small passenger jet that had strayed off course from the Cedar Rapids airport. But planes don't have wings that flap. As it cleared the tree line and soared directly overhead, I felt my heart nearly stop. This bird, because it was definitely a living thing that could fly, was the size of a regional airliner, a wingspan that must have stretched 70 feet, if not more. Its body was long and serpentine, covered in what looked like scales or maybe just really leathery skin. Whatever it was, it caught in the early morning light. The head was all wrong for a bird, sort of elongated like a crocodile's, with a ridge of spines running down its neck and back. It was flying pretty low, too, about twice the height of the tallest pines. Close enough I could see the leathery texture of its wings and the way its long tail whipped behind it for balance. For a split second, I swear it looked down at us, with eyes that seemed like a reptile's. Without thinking, instinct compelled me to shout, "Run!" Maybe it wasn't the best idea, but I feared for our lives. Realistically, where exactly could we run that this thing couldn't just follow us and catch us? But the most vivid fear I've ever felt took over me. We were making a mad dash through the marsh, clutching the shotguns so close to our chests we thought they were lifelines. And they might have been if the worst happened. Duke was ahead of us, making a beeline for the truck. The creature screeched again as it passed overhead. It was so loud I even saw it vibrate the water around our legs. It continued on its path, flying east over the marsh and eventually disappearing. We made it to the truck in record time, piling in with Duke still dripping wet in the back seat. We sat there for a moment, breathing hard. And eventually, my older boy broke the silence. Did we all just see the same thing? Tell me what you saw. My younger one answered first. It was a freaking dinosaur. Dad, that looked like a goddamn pterodactyl. I wasn't gonna argue. I just didn't have a better explanation than that. I mean, come on. It looked reptilian. It really did look like something from Jurassic Park. But that's not something you're supposed to see over eastern freaking Iowa. After some debate, we worked up the courage to go back for our gear. The ducks that had been paralyzed with fear were gone now. So if they were brave enough to go back up in the air, maybe we were okay. Everything in the marsh seemed to have returned to normal. That was our favorite spot, and we didn't go back after that. Found some new and good places, and we've become a bit friendlier whenever we see other hunters about. Because feeling alone out there doesn't quite feel as good as it used to. I have never run so fast. From infrequency. All I've got anymore these days is deer hunting. But that's okay by me. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Marines. And now for me, the quiet of the forest is therapeutic. My hunting partner, I'll call him M, had served in my same unit. We bonded quickly over our shared New England roots, and we kept in touch afterwards, having gotten out about 5 years ago. And we both loved hunting. Certain parts of the year we'd take a week away from jobs, wives, and the noise of everyday life, becoming just 2 former jarheads tracking deer through the mountains, drinking bourbon by the fire, not talking much about the things we saw overseas. A certain November, we set up a camp near the Glastonbury mountain area. It's a spot known for good hunting, but also known for some local folklore. The locals have stories about people going missing there, as well as strange sounds and other backwoods tales that Em and I would laugh at over beers at the local tavern. After all, we'd been Marines. We'd seen real horror. Ghost stories didn't move the needle much for us. A couple days into our expedition that year, the weather took a turn for the cold that had not been properly forecasted. A light snow had fallen overnight, and tracking became easier but the hunting more challenging. We split up mid-morning, planning to circle back to our rendezvous point by early afternoon. I was moving slow through a dense stand of maples, and I saw movement about 80 yards out. Through the scope of my rifle, I was expecting to see a buck, but what I saw instead made my heart stop. It was a human figure, a man or woman hanging from a large oak tree. I immediately lowered my rifle and moved forward. As I got closer, there was no doubt about it. It was a man hanging by a rope around his neck from a tree, swaying ever so slightly in the breeze. The body appeared weathered, like it'd been there for weeks, heck, maybe even months. The clothes were all tatters, and the face was now unrecognizable from decay and what looked like animal predation. I keyed my walkie-talkie. "M, I need you at my position now." His response was immediate. "Something wrong? Well, what's your location?" "About half a mile northeast of the split. There's a body out here." I gave him more precise directions while keeping my eyes fixed on this hanging figure. Something felt very wrong about this, but when finding a dead body, it often feels disturbingly wrong. Despite the apparent state of decay, though, there were no birds or insects around the body. In the cold, maybe that's not unusual, but even the area around the tree seemed very, very quiet. Mike got to me about 10 minutes later, breathing hard from practically running the whole way. "Jesus Christ," he whispered when he saw it. His Marine training kicked in. "We need to call this in." I nodded. I already had my cell phone out. Surprisingly, I had 1 bar of service. I dialed 911 and waited for it to connect. That's when M grabbed my arm. "Wait. Look." I glanced up from my phone. The body was still there, swaying gently like before. I blinked very quickly, and I kid you not, the rope was still there, but the body wasn't. It had vanished. "Did you see that?" I couldn't finish the sentence. M nodded slowly, face pale beneath his cold, reddened cheeks. "It's gone. It just disappeared." I looked at the ground below the rope, hoping the thing had just fallen from the tree, but no. It was completely gone. Before the 911 operator came on the line, I hung up. I couldn't form any words at that moment, and I didn't know what I would tell them. We stood there in stunned silence for several moments, staring at the empty robe still hanging from the branch. "You need to go," M finally said. "Now." At that very instant, a scream tore through the forest, distinctly female, coming from somewhere to our right. Before I could react, another scream answered from the left, then another from behind us, and within seconds, the entire forest erupted with the sounds of female screams in every direction, the cries seeming to come from everywhere all at once. M screamed at me, "Move!" and we both took off in the direction of the forest edge, which we knew was about a half-mile away. The screaming got worse as we ran, growing louder by the second. It reminded me of the aftermath of an IED explosion. The kind of raw, pained scream that stays with you long after you've left the battlefield. But these were all women's voices, dozens of them surrounding us entirely. We ran through the forest, merrily avoiding fallen logs and underbrush. I held that rifle close and thought, ain't gonna save us in this situation. At a certain point, the screaming was so loud it was almost deafening. Even so, I didn't dare turn around or look anywhere else but straight ahead. Soon we broke through the tree line into an open field that bordered the forest road where we'd parked our truck. The moment, and I need you to listen here, the exact moment our boots hit the open ground beyond the tree line, the screaming stopped. It didn't fade, it didn't diminish. It just stopped. M, breathing heavily, looked at me. We turned back to the forest then together. They were silent and still, looking as peaceful and ordinary as any New England forest in November. "Man, screw this," Em finally managed. I agreed. So many years of hunting those woods, 2 tours in some of the worst places on earth, and nothing had ever prepared me for what I just experienced. We packed up our camp in record time and drove 3 hours straight without stopping. We talked non-stop on the drive home, debating our different theories about what could have happened, and I think we settled on some sort of shared hallucination. But I don't recall sharing some mysterious delicious mushrooms with them. We actually still do our hunting out there from time to time. So far, so good. No more ghostly hanging men. Rednecks versus Baby Bigfoot. From We Out Here. My wife and I have been hunting the Ouachita Mountains since before we married. And this experience happened back in 1997, one late June. A story I've been wanting to share with y'all for a while. It was hot as blazes out there that year, and we'd spotted a small herd of deer moving through our back property earlier that week. We decided it would be fun to spend Saturday morning in our tree stand about 2 miles out into the national forest that borders the land. We've been up there since before dawn, all snug as a bug about 15 feet up an old oak, with good visibility of a small clearing and a game trail. By the middle of the morning the woods were quiet, except for the occasional bird call. But no deer were coming through, and the heat was starting to get worse. Donna was falling asleep, back against the trunk, and I kept watch, sipping some lukewarm coffee from my thermos. After a while I saw something odd at the base of a pine tree about 30 yards ahead. No way, I thought. It's a bear cub. A cool sight until you realize that Mama's probably nearby. I nudged Donna awake and put my finger to my lips, then pointed. The animal was small, maybe 3 feet tall, crouched down by the base of the tree. As we watched it, we soon realized this wasn't a bear we were looking at. It stood on 2 legs, for one thing, and its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were much longer than they should be, and its head seemed directly attached to shoulders, with barely any neck to speak of. Its body was covered in dark brown hair or fur, not nearly as shaggy as a bear's, but not like any animal I recognized. The hair was shorter on its face, which I could see in profile, as it concentrated on whatever it was doing. "Hun, what in God's name is that?" Donna whispered to me. I shook my head, 'cause I didn't know, but I didn't take my eyes off the thing. It seemed to be playing with the bark on the pine tree, peeling strips off and examining them before discarding them on the ground. Its movements were precise, unlike a bear cub. Reminded me more of a grown chimpanzee or a gorilla. Occasionally it would stop and look around, but it never looked up toward our position. We watched it for several minutes, completely stunned. My gun was in my lap, but I didn't even think about it at the time. Just watching this thing that wasn't human behave so very human was astonishing to us. Donna finally said it, and I think we'd both been thinking it for a while. "It looks like a young Sasquatch." Again, I would have laughed if I hadn't been thinking the same thing. We heard stories, of course. Everyone in these parts had. Everyone knows somebody around here who's encountered a supposed Bigfoot out in the woods, especially hunters. But I never did put much stock into those stories. The kind of story you smile at 'cause it's fun to hear from friends, but then don't think about it much later. I've heard tales about strange footprints or these eerie howls in the night, but never thought I'd see something myself. The little creature had just discovered a beetle under a piece of bark, and we watched it, watching the beetle, crawling across its palm. And then a sound came. There was this deep and big call that started real low and rose to a bellow. It echoed throughout the entire forest. It came from somewhere deeper in the woods, maybe a quarter-mile away, but it carried along the air perfectly. Might as well have come from right next to us. The little creature's head snapped up instantly. It dropped the bark it was holding, and the beetle, it let out a high-pitched sound in response. Then it took off running, on two legs no less, toward the source of that sound, moving very fast. Before long it disappeared into the brush. My wife and I sat there, dumbfounded. I was smiling like a madman, and what a way to start the day. Suddenly Donna reached over and gripped my hand. We should probably go, just in case. I realized what she meant. Same way you don't want to be around a mama bear when its cubs are about, I don't think you want to be around a mother Sasquatch when her baby is about. So we prepared our things and went back, agreeing in later conversation that what we saw really was a baby Bigfoot. And we must have heard the thing's mama call it back for some breakfast. Warning. The following story contains depictions of violence against pets. The thing that got my Lobo. From Benicio. The first time I saw the chupacabra, I was 12 years old. It happened during the dry season of 1992 in the mountains outside Monterey. My father had taken me on my first hunting trip for javelina, in a region that borders the eastern Sierra Madre. Lobo came with us. He was a magnificent black and tan Mexican shepherd mix. Lean and smart, the best tracking dog in our village. He'd been by my side since I was 7 years old, and I couldn't imagine a hunting trip without him. I remember my father telling me as we set up camp, "Tonight you become a hunter." His face seemed so proud. We didn't use hunting blinds or tree stands. Our method was simple. Find a good vantage point, be patient, and let Lobo track once we'd wounded our prey. We settled against a rocky outcropping that overlooked a small watering hole. Javelinas would come to drink at dusk, my father explained. The light was nearly gone when Lobo began to growl. "Quiet," my father whispered. But Lobo continued, looking agitated. This wasn't his usual alertness. This was different. Even at that age I could tell. My father frowned. I remember him looking round. And he said to me, "I don't know what it is." The growling then stopped, and Lobo's ears perked up. He stared intently at the opposite side of the watering hole, where the brush was thick. Then, without a warning, he bolted from our side, racing towards whatever he sensed. "Lobo, no!" I cried out. But it was too late. He disappeared in the dark. My father grabbed my arm as I started to run after him. "No, stay here," he commanded. He reached for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, we heard Lobo's frantic barking, followed by a sound I'll never forget. Something between a growl and a roar, higher pitched, almost a hiss too, but with a rattling quality that would appear in some of my nightmares later. Then there was a yelp of pain from Lobo, and the sounds of a struggle. My father switched on the flashlight, sweeping its beam toward the commotion. For a brief moment the light illuminated the scene across the watering hole. There was an animal there, hunched over Lobo, its back to us. The thing was hairless, with this grayish-green skin that glistened in the light. Its spine protruded sharply. I'd never seen anything like it. Each of its vertebrae was visible through the taut skin. But what I remember most clearly were the spines. Not fur, but actual quill-like projections running down its back. It turned its head towards our light, and then I saw its eyes. These large, round things. I didn't see a mouth, but Lobo's back and tan coat were dark and damp with blood. My father dropped the flashlight then. I heard him fumbling with his gun. Minnie screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. My father had to grab me by the collar and drag me backward. Only then did my legs remember how to work. I'll never forget running like that through the dark. So scared and yet so angry that someone had hurt my dog. I guess it would be a something. We didn't stop running until we made it back to the truck. My father practically threw me in the passenger seat. Inside, I had to ask my dad like 3 or 4 times what that was, before he finally said just once, "Chupacabra." I'd heard stories about the chupacabra. Everyone in our region had, but they were supposed to be just stories to frighten kids into coming back before dark, to get folks to look after their livestock better. "We have to go back for Lobo," I pleaded with him, but he shook his head. "Lobo is gone. There's not going to be anything left for us to find out there, unless you want to end up like him." When we got home, my father told my mother we had lost Lobo to a cougar. He never spoke of what he really saw, not to anyone. When others in the village reported livestock drained of blood in the months that followed, he would leave the room. It's been decades since then. I've had other dogs in that time, but I've never taken another dog hunting. And though I still do hunt occasionally, I'm always back at my car before the sun sets. The image of that creature hunching over my dog's body still infuriates me and haunts me. My father went to his grave, never publicly acknowledging what we saw that night. But I know what took Lobo from us, and it wasn't any cougar. The Kentucky Bug Lights, from Sinclair. I've lived and hunted my entire life in rural Kentucky, close to the border with West Virginia, on land that's been in my family since before my grandfather was born. Hunting is practically a rite of passage around here, and my dad taught me everything he knew about tracking, patience, and respecting the woods. He always stressed that the land had secrets older than any of us, things that couldn't be explained easily by logic or reason. I'd always brushed those stories off as superstition or folklore passed down from generation to generation, meant to scare children into obedience. Growing up, I often heard about the lights people sometimes saw in the woods, little flickers and glimmers that would vanish if you tried to approach. My granddad swore he'd seen them more than once. Pale lights bobbing silently through the trees, always near a steep ravine at the edge of our family's property. He once warned me never to venture close to that ravine, recounting tales of hunters and hikers who'd vanished without a trace. I respected his wishes, mostly out of love for him, rather than belief in his stories. But something happened during deer season last year that's left me questioning everything I've ever known about these mountains. The morning it happened was colder than usual, late October, and the leaves had mostly fallen, covering the forest floor in noisy layers. I got to my tree stand just before sunrise, bundled in heavy gear and armed with a rifle I'd inherited from my granddad. Normally I feel at peace up there. There's something calming about watching the woods wake up around you. But that day was different from the start. An hour or two passed quietly, just the usual bird song and squirrels making their rounds. But around mid-morning, everything went eerily quiet. No birds, no wind, not even distant traffic from the county road. It was as if the world had suddenly hit mute. I shivered. I figured maybe a predator like a bobcat or coyote had spooked everything silent. That's when I heard a sound I'll never forget. A distant metallic clang, like someone striking an old church bell far off through the trees. The sound echoed, unnatural and hollow, and it immediately felt wrong. There's nothing like that anywhere near here. No old structures, no metal towers, nothing. Curiosity got the better of me. I climbed down quietly and decided to follow the direction of the noise, carefully picking my way through thick shrubs and tangled growth, stepping slowly to keep my presence hidden. After a few minutes, the metallic ringing came again, this time closer, clearer, and strangely rhythmic, almost like a deliberate call and response. I moved cautiously toward the steep ravine my granddad had always warned me about, despite my better judgment. As I reached the edge, I noticed a faint glint down in the gully, like sunlight reflecting off something shiny. Peering over the edge, my heart dropped. There, only partially buried in moss and leaves, was an enormous metal ring, like a wheel or a hatch, embedded in the earth. It looked rusted and ancient, nothing I'd ever seen before, about 10 feet across, half hidden by decades of forest growth. But what made me freeze was the fresh dirt around it, clearly disturbed, as if something had recently emerged. As I stared, another metallic clang sounded, this time directly beneath me. The ground vibrated subtly under my feet. I scrambled backward, heart racing. Then I heard a low clicking, almost mechanical but somehow organic. I froze, crouched behind a tree, barely breathing, eyes fixed on the rusted hatch. Slowly, something emerged. Honestly, I had no idea what to expect coming from that hatch. Maybe a person, a mysterious old survivalist hermit. But that wasn't the case at all. This thing's body was covered in segmented plates, almost insect-like, reflecting faintly in the sunlight. Its limbs ended in strange clawed appendages, and its head was small, featureless, and oval. It moved awkwardly, with jerky, twitchy motions, testing the air like it sensed something. Could it already sense I was there? My chest tightened, and I began to worry it might. I stayed completely still, praying silently. After a few agonizing moments, it retreated slowly back toward the hatch, making that disturbing clicking noise, until it disappeared below ground. I didn't wait another second. I bolted through the trees, not caring about noise or stealth, racing home as fast as I could. When I stumbled into our kitchen, pale and shaking, my dad instantly knew something was wrong. He listened silently as I described what I'd seen. He didn't doubt me. Instead, he quietly admitted he'd seen lights in that ravine as a teenager, but had never gotten close enough to see more. He told me his father had always believed something unnatural was buried deep beneath our land. Something better left undisturbed. Next time I went back, I brought a friend of mine with me after a week of constantly telling him about my sighting. He asked me to show him the hatch, and excitement beat out my fear of the place, so I agreed. However, as we made it to the spot where I swear the hatch was before, it wasn't there. In fact, the surrounding area didn't exactly match what I remember seeing. It was impossible. To this day, I believe that I misremembered the way there. Chances are I'll never be able to find it again. And now, whenever I hear those stories of strange lights or disappearances whispered around town, I find myself listening a little closer, no longer dismissing them so easily. Beware the Lost Ones. From Anon. I've spent most of my life in the woods of northern Michigan, in a stretch of rugged woods my dad always said could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. The dense forests and hilly terrain could confuse even experienced hikers, which made sense, considering the occasional missing person posters that might appear, taped to utility poles each season. My family always took safety seriously, never venturing off alone too far, always sticking to the trails we knew by heart. 2 years ago, during rifle season for deer, something happened that I've kept mostly quiet about. It started on a grey afternoon in November, when the air felt very heavy and cold with incoming snow. My cousin Jim and I were up in separate tree stands about a half-mile apart, keeping an eye out for deer. I'd been sitting there since dawn, when I spotted something moving through the trees across a clearing, about a football field away. My first thought was another hunter, though it seemed odd since no one else had permission to hunt our land. I squinted through my scope, and I saw clearly it was a person. A young woman in a bright red jacket, something bright you'd wear to stay visible during hunting season. But the way she moved was odd. She was stumbling and slow, almost looking dazed. I felt worried then, wondering if she might be injured or lost. I climbed down and moved toward her quietly, calling out softly to avoid scaring her off. But when I got to where she was, I couldn't find her. She was nowhere to be seen. Even more odd, I couldn't find any trace of her. I figured I could find at least some footprints, but there was nothing. I circled around for a bit, completely baffled, and eventually I just climbed back into my tree stand. About 20 minutes after that, I saw her again, this time in the opposite direction. Same bright jacket, same lost, wandering look. I called out louder this time, clearer, telling her to stay put, that I was coming over. And again, when I got there, she was completely gone, without a trace. It was starting to feel very unsettling, like she was just disappearing like a ghost. That very same night, I mentioned the events to my elder brother. He just shrugged at me, suggesting maybe my eyes were playing tricks, but more than likely, in his opinion, it was probably just some nearby campers who didn't know they were trespassing, or maybe they did, and when I called down to them, I spooked them. I guess that made sense, but something about the whole thing still felt wrong. Maybe the absence of footprints. The weekend after that, I hunted with my cousin, who is skeptical of pretty much anything that might be supernatural or unexplained. We chose some places not far apart, so we'd be within shouting distance. Sure enough, after about an hour, I saw the woman again. Same coat, same slow movement, going through the trees cautiously. I waved frantically to my cousin, and he nodded. I wasn't alone in this. He was seeing her too. We quietly approached the spot together from opposite sides. But again, there was nothing to be found. We were so confused, searching for any sign of her, but coming up empty, as you would expect. My cousin laughed at me, saying that maybe it really was a ghost after all. But I didn't like that. Surely there was a real explanation to this. After that, we started to hear stories about the place. Apparently, we weren't the first to glimpse her. There were some folks around town who had glimpsed a lone figure moving silently through the woods, always seemingly disappearing at the last second. Some people suggested it might be related to someone who went missing a few decades ago. A young woman who wandered off a nearby trailhead, and to this day wasn't found. One day I did finally see her very clearly. One cold morning I was walking the trail to a hunting spot when she appeared directly in front of me. I mean 50 feet away or less. The girl looked young, barely 20, dressed lightly for autumn weather. Oddly out of place, staring blankly ahead. Her face seemed expressionless, pale, like she didn't even notice the cold. I took a step forward, and I tried to speak to her softly, trying to get her attention. She didn't respond or even look my way. Instead, she turned slowly, walking behind this big oak tree. But she disappeared right after that. I hurried forward, circling the tree, but I didn't see her. Once again, there was nothing. This shook me up. It was physically impossible for me not to find her this time. So there was only one conclusion, a supernatural one. I began to avoid that area. I mean, I never felt threatened, but the uncertainty of seeing someone who couldn't possibly be there unsettled me. I wonder if it really was that missing woman they told me about. Whatever happened to her, it caused her to stay there, haunting the place she'd been lost, even after her death. When I do go back to that spot, I won't be going alone. Something took my uncle. From R. Royce. When I was about 10 years old, my family owned a small hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was our weekend getaway, a place my father and uncle had built themselves when they were young men, hoping to pass on their love of the outdoors to the next generation. Some of my happiest memories came from those weekends when my two cousins, Arnold and Liam, would come over, and we'd spend hours exploring, playing hide-and-seek, and building forts. The cabin was a rustic place with wood walls and a fireplace that my dad built stone by stone. It smelled permanently of cedar, old wool blankets, and smoky logs. Our families had traditions rooted deeply in that cabin. Each autumn during deer season, our fathers would prepare meticulously for their hunts, sharpening knives, cleaning rifles, laying out heavy hunting clothes the night before. My mother and dad would cook hearty meals, and we kids would gather around the fireplace to hear stories about the woods. Often stories about legendary deer our dads had tracked, or even playful ghost stories meant to frighten and delight us. It was a magical time, until the year everything changed. One afternoon our dads had gone hunting just after lunch, dressed in their camo, promising to return before sundown. My cousins and I spent the day as we always did, roaming free and getting our clothes dirty, inventing endless ways to amuse ourselves and endless ways to irritate our mothers. As evening came, we started a game of hide-and-seek, a game that's much more exciting the less light there is. I remember hiding behind the old woodshed and holding my breath, as that was when I heard footsteps crunching slowly through leaves. Thinking someone had found me, I peered around the corner, only to see my dad walking alone from the woods. I shouted to greet him, and then instantly asking where my uncle was. But Dad didn't respond. In fact, he didn't even look at me. His face was so serious. He just stared straight ahead and continued walking. I'd never seen him like that before, and at that age I was both confused and nauseated by the sight. I had that feeling like something bad was about to happen. But I guess it already had. We rushed inside after him, questions spilling out of our mouths, but he brushed past us without a word, collapsing heavily into a chair at the kitchen table. My mother and aunt immediately saw his distress and asked about my uncle. Dad remained quiet, though. He just stared at the surface of the table. The man acted like he was hypnotized. Eventually, my mother sent us kids upstairs. We didn't argue with her. I don't think we wanted to stick around with Dad's strange attitude. We huddled together at the top of the staircase, though, curious and listening. We only got snatches of conversation as things floated up from there. What we heard from my dad when he finally started to speak were mentions of shouting and panic and a frantic search. Soon after, we saw headlights through the windows. A local sheriff arrived. There was a small search party. They, along with my dad, went into the woods. For days, we saw dozens of people combing through that forest, calling my uncle's name. But I'm sad to say, they never found him. Not even a shred of clothing, not a single clue. My father refused to speak to his family about what exactly happened. Even when he talked to my mother and my aunt, it was implied to us that they didn't get the whole story from him. And for a time there I wondered if my dad killed his own brother. But then again, they loved each other, and I wasn't sure why he would ever do that. But the cabin now, once our happiest place, had become a haunted place. We began to visit less frequently, and eventually my dad actually decided to sell it. We even packed up and moved out of state. I think Dad had to have a fresh start. Several years after that, when I was a teenager, my father had too much to drink one evening. After quite a bit of prying, I managed to get him to open up about the incident. His voice trembled when he said it. I thought he was about to cry. He described tracking a deer with my uncle. The woods were quiet and familiar as they should be. But suddenly, my uncle stopped mid-step, eyes going wide. My dad said he looked to be staring at something in the distance. So Dad asked what he saw. But before my uncle could answer, he let out a scream and was violently thrown to the ground by something my dad couldn't see. Dad lunged forward, desperate to help, even fired his rifle wildly into empty air, but nothing struck the unseen target. My uncle was dragged, kicking and screaming through the woods. Dad says he chased after him, firing until his ammunition ran dry. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing visible for him to shoot at. My uncle's screams faded into a horrifying silence, and my father spent hours searching desperately through those woods, shouting his name until his voice gave out. But he didn't find him. Didn't find blood or tracks or even a sign of a struggle. It was all just still. The sheriff, the townspeople, even other family members questioned my dad repeatedly, suspicious of the story he told them. But what else could he say? He'd seen his brother vanish at the hands of some unseen force, and he knew no one would believe those aspects. So he kept quiet about that part, and he's been carrying that guilt the entire time. The revelation left me disturbed, to say the least. My dad had never been one to lie, especially to his own kids. The man refused to tell us Santa Claus was real for Christ's sake, said lying to us kids was just another form of childhood trauma, and refused to let my mom do the Santa Claus thing. Even now, my uncle's case remains unsolved. My father doesn't speak of it. You can try to get it out of him, but that's a quick way to piss him off. I'm broken-hearted for my cousins and aunt, but they're doing better these days. But we all still miss my uncle.
Don't miss out on amazing content. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. Join our community today.